Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Goh Ken-Yi, the grandson of the late Dr. Goh Keng Swee and the apple of his eye, will now deliver his eulogy.
Mr. President, Mr. Prime Minister, ministers, family, distinguished guests, fellow Singaporeans, ladies and gentlemen, I feel very privileged to speak before you this afternoon about my grandfather, about what he meant to me. In the days ahead, as our children grow and become aware of the important things in life, my wife and I will inevitably share with them, as we have shared with them in the past, though perhaps in simpler terms, the story of their great-grandfather, my Akong. As I ponder what I will tell our three boys, I am tinged with a little regret because, as a result of his failing health, they did not get much of a chance to interact with him as I did, to know him as I have, to see his kindness, humility, and integrity firsthand. My earliest memories of my grandfather are of the time I spent weekends with him at his house along Goodwood Hill. Now, as we all know, moments spent with grandparents are precious and indulgent, and there were many things I enjoyed, not the least of which was bedtime with my grandfather. He would tell me a story or two, and then, as I lay on the cusp of sleep, he would gently stroke my hair. Sometimes he would fall asleep before I did, and being the spoiled child that I was, I would nudge him awake. And he would always continue despite his own fatigue. I did not appreciate then, as I do now, that this was occurring at a time during the mid-70s when he was working tirelessly towards building some part of the nation that is the Singapore we know today, and that I was selfishly depriving him of much needed weekend rest. Today, as I listen to what people say and read the newspapers about how, despite his busy schedule, he was always concerned about the welfare of laborers, hawkers, soldiers, men in the street, I marvel at how this was so in keeping with the selfless and caring grandfather I saw at home. During my early teens, my grandfather bought me a camera, a Nikon EM, which I still keep with me till this day. Photography was something he was passionate about, and this gift was meant not only to see if I would pick up the same hobby, but probably also to get me to hone my sense of the world, to start appreciating nature at its simplest, the things around us that we often overlook or take for granted. So we would visit the zoo, bird park, air shows, parades, fireworks, clicking away with our cameras. The one thing that I found difficult to capture a picture of was my grandfather himself. Being a reluctant subject, he would usually brush me off whenever I wanted to snap a shot of him and redirect my attention to something else. A few times though, perhaps when he was in a better mood, I did manage to get him to emerge from his shell and strike a jovial, sometimes even comical pose. Actually, I find this camera-shy aspect of him strangely inconsistent with his life as a politician. My grandfather, being innately self-effacing and preferring to avoid the limelight, always seemed to me a little at odds with his overtly public vocation. But when the time came to blaze a certain trail, he would rise to the challenge, on center stage no less if he had to. And yet, when the work was done, he would often deflect any notion of praise directed towards him. His unassuming facility is something I feel we sometimes lack in an age where self-promotion has become an accepted tenet of society. A moment I will always remember and cherish is when I was about to start my working life. My grandfather had asked me to his office, and I figured that he was going to chastise me about being somewhat distracted and not knowing what career path to take. You see, I had graduated with an engineering degree, but had no intention of becoming an engineer. Further, instead of minoring in economics, as he had recommended, I decided to spend an extra year to acquire a second degree in English literature. And so, as I was about to begin my career in the investment industry, he called me in for a quick chat. I was in the midst of a fluffy explanation as to how I intended to cope with my new job. For example, that I would study and sit for my CFA while I worked, take a financial modeling course, etc., etc. When he stopped me, eyeballed me for a second and said, "Ken-Yi, all this doesn't matter. In working life, first and foremost, what you need to be is a reliable and responsible person. At first, you may be given some tasks to complete. Later in your career, you will be setting these tasks yourself as you rise through management. Whichever the case, you must always be a person others can count on to do a good job, whether the end result is successful or not." And this is why I could really appreciate and understand the sentiments of a particular lady who was sitting next to me during evening service earlier this week. Like many people before and after her who have worked under my grandfather, she had been tasked to produce a report for him on a particular project. And when she had not heard back from him a week post-submission, she thought the matter was closed, or perhaps she might have to look for a new job, only to receive a call from my grandfather a few weeks later informing her that he had decided not to proceed with the project, but that she had done a good job in any case. This lady was clearly very touched that he had bothered to get back to her on her report. So there you have it. I think I will share in greater detail with our three boys these three anecdotes about their great-grandfather. Anecdotes that I believe show aspects of his selflessness towards family and fellow man, his intrinsic humility despite his many contributions, and at the core of his soul, a great sense of moral responsibility. This, coupled with his creative brilliance, often culminated in a new concept, ideal, or institution, which he always saw through to fruition. Truth be told, I'm quite sure I'm not describing anything new, as I think he represented these same great principles to many people across our nation and even beyond. To me, however, he was simply a great-grandfather. Please allow me to close by quoting from a book he gave me in 1989, The Ascent of Man, written by Dr. Jacob Bronowski. The book traces the rise of man and the evolution of science and was one of my grandfather's favorites. I quote, Knowledge is not a loose leaf notebook of facts. Above all, it is a responsibility for the integrity of what we are, primarily of what we are as ethical creatures. The personal commitment of a man to his skill, the intellectual commitment, and the emotional commitment, working together as one, has made the ascent of man. As you listen to these words, I hope you share my belief that we and all Singapore have been most fortunate to have been able to bask in the ascent of this man, Goh Keng Swee. Thank you.